seam finishes. The first seam is a plain seam. So you will put your two pieces of fabric and place them with right sides together, pin the cut edges together, and you stitch a seam using 1/2 inch seam allowance. Remembering that you backstitch at the beginning and the end of your seam, and that backstitching needs to be about 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. The second seam is a French seam. So a French seam, you would choose to use this seam if you were working with a sheer fabric. The outside of the garment, you do not see anything. So this is when you're wearing the garment, you wouldn't see anything. And on the inside, all of your raw edges are enclosed. So to create this seam, you start by placing wrong sides together. So this is the wrong side of my fabric, and I place wrong sides together, and you stitch a 1/4 of an inch seam. This is already trimmed down for the next step. So originally it was out here. I've stitched a 1/4 of an inch seam. Next, you're going to trim it. So you take your scissors and you cut that seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. Take that over to the iron, and you get the tip of your iron right inside the seam and press it open. Now you're going to flip that around and get the seam right on the edge. Press it, and the remaining step, you're stitching 1/4 of an inch from this folded edge. And on my sample, I've left it open so you can see the different steps here. But you are going to stitch the entire length of your fabric. Attach it to the paper. The third seam finish is a flat felled seam. So this is what the seam looks like when it's finished here. This is on the outside of the garment. This is the inside. And this is a very sturdy, very strong seam allowance that you would use. The most common place you see this is on the inseam of jeans. The inseam is on the inside of your leg, and the outseam is on the outside of your leg. So on the inside, your legs could rub together, and you would want a very strong seam finish there, and that's why you would choose this one. All right, to start, you are going to stitch your seam, 1/2 inch seam, but again, this time you're placing wrong sides together. So I'm starting wrong sides together, lining up my edges here, pinning it, stitching a 1/2 inch seam. Next, you are going to press the seam open. So you take this over to the iron, press it open, and then you're going to press that seam flat to one side. Now you take your scissors and you're going to trim this underneath seam allowance. So when I get up close here, you can see I've trimmed that down to 1/8 of an inch. It's very small there. And then on the longer seam allowance, you're going to take and you're going to fold under 1/4 of an inch, press that, and then you pin that down in place. It's going to go through this garment, so through this layer, and then you are going to stitch while it's flat. So you're stitching through the garment, and you're stitching right along the edge. And again, you're using pins to keep this pinned in place. So it's a nice even width the entire length of this seam finish.